Warning, this content may be upsetting or disturbing to some audiences. Sailors of Reddit, what's the weirdest/creepiest thing you've seen at sea? I have family who sailed around the world. One day in the North Atlantic, their sailboat was going over some gigantic swells. They didn't have brakes at the top, so it was safe, but the boat was rising and falling way beyond the neutral. At the bottom of a trough, my uncle looked up to see the sun behind a wave and the silhouette of a whale inside, above him. When diving, a huge sign of net drifting towards you. It wasn't anchored or attached to anything. Just a huge whirling cloud of death, full of barnacles and dolphin skeletons and decomposing fish. It was a foggy night off the shore of Long Island and I was on a 75-foot schooner. The fog was so thick that you couldn't see more than 10 feet in front of you. The captain tells me there is no point to continue my watch at the bow of the ship, and him and I start talking at the stern. We both turn to see a figure dressed in black flowing robes walking towards us on the outside of the ship. The robes were scratching down the outside of the ship. It keeps coming closer and is high enough in the air that the top was about even with our heads. Lol. Fishing out near the Great Barrier Reef, and my brother, who gets seasick, decides to go for a swim to settle his stomach, and less than a minute after getting back into the boat, a 17-foot great white went under the boat. Toilets on boats are usually plumbed with seawater because it makes no sense to SHT in your limited drinking water. One night I was taking the watch on a long-haul sail up the US East Coast. We were rounding the FL Keys about to point towards Maine. I had to use the head, so I went below and pumped some water into the bowl. It was glowing in the dark. Freaked me out so much. Turns out there is photoluminescent phytoplankton in the water which will glow if pumped into a dark toilet bowl. No longer scary, actually pretty neat. This huge turtle as big as a Volkswagen Beetle. It went right under our boat. Shit was crazy. The stars. When you're 3 days from the nearest land, and it's a clear night. More stars than you could ever imagined. And enough shooting stars to make you run out of wishes. It was also pretty cool being stuck in the Panama Canal with a Los Angeles-class submarine when they had to shut down the locks. Before we knew what was going on, there were helicopters everywhere dropping off Marines to set up around the lock. California to Los Angeles. Not me, but my father back in his commercial fishing days noticed that there was a t-shirt in the middle of his net after one tow. After a little investigation he found that it was not a shirt, but a human torso wearing a shirt. His captain radioed ahead and they brought the torso back to the docks, where they were met by the police and a coroner. They were eventually able to identify the body, based on the clothing, as a victim of a plane crash that had occurred fairly recently. After that he got angry and told him to throw it back. Fog. 360 degrees of thick fog. You can hardly see a couple feet in front of your face. Very creepy. And water spouts, those are pretty cool though. Well, I'm no sailor, but am in the military. On September 11, 2013 I was on a ship in the Red Sea. We were having a ceremony in remembrance of 9/11, when up floats a dead body right next to the ship. We were all locked down pretty quickly so that they could send out a couple small boats to retrieve it. Pretty damn weird if you ask me though. I've been in the US Navy for almost a decade and I am currently on my 3rd deployment to the Western Pacific. I work on communications equipment and spend a fair amount of time just scanning different frequencies to see what I come across. A couple years back we were 30 to 40 nautical miles off the coast of the Philippines. It was just over the horizon, and the ship lost power. So, power is out, emergency lights are on, and the UPS are keeping comms up until the engineers can get the power back up. I am doing my usual, scanning HF freaks for anything coming out of the pie when my receiver starts picking up the most awful, interesting, horrific sounds I have ever heard in my life. It raised the hair on my neck and arms, and made me feel very, very small. It felt like I was sitting there for hours while these sounds crawled under my skin, like I was traveling through the warp without a Geller field. After about 5 minutes it suddenly stopped and the power came back on. I will never forget the sounds I heard. When I was 19, I had just gone to sea for the first time with the US Navy. A few days after heading to the Gulf of Mexico for a few weeks of drug ops, we were dispatched to the Straits of Florida because Fidel Castro had opened the doors, and people were fleeing Cuba in droves. One night after standing watch all day over dozens of people who'd been pulled out of the water, I was standing on the O3 level of the ship with a chief, smoking a cigarette. It was the only exterior surface of the ship not covered with refugees. Sailing around in the Arabian Gulf, you could look out and see flaming flares from all of the oil rigs. You get so used to blackness when you're out to sea at night, and suddenly you see massive pillars of fire rising from the ocean all around you. I came across a man who'd hung himself on his boat 5 or 6 miles offshore about 4 or 5 years ago. The eerie and truly creepy part was realizing what it was. We just saw a boat out in the middle of oceans nowhere without anything other than blue horizon in sight, at the break of dawn, and there was fairly thick fog, as it had rained the night before. Realizing that the figure hanging from the boom was a man was one of the most haunting things I'll ever see. Well, once we were motoring my 32-foot Challenger back to homeport and we were fighting a king's tide, very strong current. We couldn't raise our sails because we had some 25-knot winds and we weren't ready to handle that. We had run out of gas. Now we were in a bit of a situation as the king's tide started to pull us the other direction. This in itself wasn't that scary, but we were going about 4 knots backwards and soon we couldn't see homeport anymore. It got dark very fast. During a transatlantic sail, we saw this clump of brown about 200 yards off our starboard bow. When we sailed closer to get a close look, it was 6 leatherback turtles all dead. It looked as if someone had intentionally caught them, tied them together and left them for dead. This though was no accident. Turtles don't get tangled together and somehow make perfect pull-ins and double half hitches. I was pretty pissed off. The next week we arrived in St. Helena, which was kinda our halfway point, and I told the local turtle care initiative, that had to be some sick FCK. Heard this from a mate, Australian naval supply ship in the Great Southern Ocean, next to another naval ship. Swell was so great, the top of one ship's mast was deck level to the supply ship. Another, told by a different mate, they were fishing off the shelf, off NSW, both big enough to hold 6 blokes. A shark longer than their boat swam past. They packed up and went home. Some things are too big and have too many teeth to fish near. Probably too late to get noticed. My grandfather was in the Norwegian Merchant Navy during the Second World War. Technically non-combatants, but still dangerous as FCK. This one time they were sneaking out of a port at midnight that had been closed by the Nazis. They just pointed the ship out to sea in the pitch black and went, no lights, no nothing. He was standing peering over the side, the inky blackness, when he saw, like 20 get away, a Nazi on the deck of a darkened patrol boat light a cigarette right in front of him and then disappear. During World War II, my dad, a wireless operator on a minesweeper, passed by a German pilot, waving frantically from his still floating aircraft in the North Atlantic. They were under strict orders not to stop because of the danger of subs. So they left the poor guy to certain death. My dad died a couple of years ago, but this incident haunted him throughout his life. He wept about it even in his last few hours. Losing your ship's service generator in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, late at night. Most of the electrical service to the ship is lost until the emergency diesel generator hopefully starts up. When you're used to all the vibrations and sounds in your living spaces, silence is deafening. Probably late to this, but whatever. I was working on a car carrier 4 years ago in the Middle East. Our typical route went through pirate waters at times, and so we always picked up 4 ex-Marines as security in Aqaba, Jordan before we went, so we stopped and had to drift for a bit to figure out what the problem was. During this time I was working on the stern back end of the vessel. I couldn't really see anything out in the ocean, everything was dimly lit on the ship. I just stared back at him, kind of stunned. I was afraid if I reached for the radio to call one of the Marines he'd shoot me. The Marines had weapons. So he looked at me and I looked at him and he sort of gave me a nod as if he was telling me well played, and I gave him one back. I didn't know how many others there were. But I did call it in on the radio as soon as I lost sight of him. I still remember his face today, that deep stern concentrated look. Once thought I saw a small landmass on the horizon. Upon closer inspection it turned out to be a dead whale, belly up with seagulls standing on it pecking away at its flesh. We were once ported out of Bahrain and we woke up to this god-awful smell. We tossed on our coveralls and headed for the weather deck to find a cargo ship on the next dock stacked 5 stories high with cages of live lambs. Hurricane Katrina. We followed it down to provide aid for what everyone knew was going to be a disaster. It was as if the world had split in two. Above us was this beautiful sky with a few clouds strewn about, and then, not far ahead, was this ghastly monster that engulfed up the rest of the sky. The clouds twisted in a way I've never seen before. And the seas were very deceptive. If you looked at the water you were sailing on, the swells didn't look that intense. But I saw frigates and destroyers swallowed bow first and shot through the other side. I was lucky, my ship was quite large. Even we were getting pelted on the O5 level of a supply ship, DO, and there were forget ever walking in a straight line. Most of the time you'd be walking on the deck one moment and then the bulkhead, wall, the next. I've been in rough seas before on both smaller and larger platforms, but Hurricane Katrina took the cake. It was just an event. One that I'm glad I was following and not intercepting. While traveling between Key West, Florida and Norfolk, Virginia, roughly near Miami, our lookout called away a ship at 090. We got on our radar, range of 80 miles, and there wasn't a thing on it. No evidence of it whatsoever would present itself on the radar. Pretty creepy. I was sailing a small sunfish around an island near Florida in shallow water. As I cruised along, suddenly a large section of water directly in front of my bow exploded with a large splash. Immediately afterward my boat rammed into something under the surface and came to a complete stop. Then there was another big splash and I saw something zoom away, leaving a wake behind it. I was left freaked out and shaking. Then I thought to myself, I must have hit a big dolphin. Maybe it was a manatee? Lots of dolphins around here. So, I finished my sail and went home. You could clearly see the marks of 3 large teeth. I'm very happy that I didn't fall out of the boat that day. I was in Angola surveying a 5 meters wide corridor in preparation for the installation of a pipeline. We stumble upon this foot-long cylindrical item. Lots of head scratching. Later the client requests that it be relocated out of the corridor. The ROF moves in and inspects the item closer. Tin can? Compressed air bottle? Ordnance? ROF carefully picks the item up with its manipulator, then splat. It's only a huge bloody hunk of salami about 1,400 meters beneath the surface. Wasn't expecting that. Other finds include a twin-drum washing machine and a toilet seat. My uncle runs a charter fishing boat. He loves telling the story about how he was out in the ocean on his boat at night, and there was this beautiful woman floating in a raft unconscious. He and my cousin pulled her aboard and she began to regain consciousness and she was really drunk. Lived on a sailboat in Malaysia for a while. The monstrous jellyfish that would come floating by silently out of nowhere scared the absolute SHD out of me. Easily half a meter in diameter, and hundreds of them. Worst creatures ever. Hurricane Katrina. My ship had just passed Cook's Passage when the wind and swell drastically increased. From the bridge wings you could touch the top of the swell and the deck was flooded constantly. The scariest part was when we found our holds were taking in water. Finally, somewhere I can tell this story, quite possibly the strangest thing I have ever seen in my life. It was about 2 a.m. in the middle of the Atlantic and very dark with no moon. As I was walking up to the bow of our sailboat to inspect the sails, I saw a faint glow in the water a long way off. If you made it to the end of the video, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe and share, and we will see you in the next video.